Hello and welcome to Inside Humphreys County. I'm Daryl Mosley. I'm the Executive Director of the Humphreys County Chamber of Commerce. And this week our guest is John Farthing. He is with, he said the acronym is ARMA. It is the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts. John, I appreciate you being here. I'll be honest, I'm familiar with martial arts, probably in the layman understanding that most people are. Had friends who have taken the Eastern styles, the karate and that sort of thing. Renaissance martial arts is not something I have been familiar with. How is that different, or how does that fit in with the other ones?
It fits in with the other ones biomechanically speaking. I mean, there's only so many ways the human body moves, and the need for martial art, whether it's in the East or the West or anywhere in the world, generally stems from a need to protect yourself, your loved ones, your life, or your way of life. So martial arts tend to be born out of necessity. What makes them different is they're not from the East. Many of us, like yourself, myself, probably many of the viewers here in Humphreys County, are of Western heritage.
Right.
And these martial arts represent that Western heritage. While the martial arts of the East are known to be and are very sophisticated, our martial arts in the West are equally so. We in the West don't understand or appreciate our martial heritage largely because we're unaware of it. But as a youth growing up, reading voraciously the tales of King Arthur, Robin Hood, etc., I was fascinated by knights, and I wanted to know, how did knights fight? How did they train to fight? And these questions kept coming back to me, and they weren't really satisfactorily being answered in the history books. They weren't satisfactorily being answered in the history courses that I was taking. And history itself is a great indicator to suggest that these martial arts, they were viable, because look at the track record of the knights. I mean, they weren't simply being defeated. So there was the question that they weren't the clumsy, overly heavy armor and weapons that we see so often in film and literature and pop culture, but rather that there was something more. And these questions were the questions that I sought to answer, and are largely what the ARMA is trying to answer and to understand is what is the Western martial culture, particularly our particular area of interest or study is the martial arts of medieval and Renaissance Western Europe. Of course, there are a lot of European martial arts like French savate or Greek pankration, but we're specifically focusing on a specific time window and period of Western European heritage.
Now, has there been as far as studying the history of and doing the research, has there been a lot of records kept as far as how this fighting was done back that many years ago and the weapons used and that sort of thing?
Amazingly, yes. In fact, it forms the nucleus of our study and our recreation of these arts. For years, we're looking at asking these questions and looking at where are we going to find the answers? And it became obvious that Hollywood wasn't going to answer these questions. Their objective is to entertain and not to educate. Right. So they make large dramatic fight scenes that look really cool, but don't really reflect the historical reality. Next, we looked at, the Renaissance festivals. And again, it's a show, and largely designed to entertain, in some aspects to educate, but still not, that's not their sole objective.
It's not accurate.
Exactly. So what we started realizing is that nobody knew. And we also realized that we ourselves didn't really know, but we were determined to find this out. And along the way, what we discovered is there is a vast corpus of extant surviving literature, literally training manuals that were written during the medieval and Renaissance period on exactly how knights and men-at-arms would have fought, how they would have trained to fight, how they would have used these weapons, or in some cases no weapons at all, to act in personal defense of themselves, defense of their king, country, whether it be on the battlefield or in the back alleys of the behind the tavern in a rural community, or
right, just fending off an attacker for whatever reason.
Exactly.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, obviously, because this is there is a level of interest beyond just your own. How did you discover Renaissance martial arts?
Kind of a roundabout sort of way. I've always loved history. I've always loved knights and swords growing up, and even martial arts in general, whether they were Eastern or Western. Growing up, I always had a fascination with self-defense and martial arts in general. things led me around a course that eventually led me to find the best of both worlds in the ARMA and the organization that I'm currently with. But the way it happened, I guess it started with the love and the fascination. Then in my youth, I did, some Eastern martial arts because it was the only thing that was around, the only thing that I was aware of. Moved into college and got into fencing because it gave me an avenue to explore sword play. But again, it's a formal sport. So there were a lot of things that I couldn't do, or questions that still weren't being answered. You're not allowed to do this because it breaks the rules. Well, in the battlefields of medieval Europe, there were no rules.
Right.
So in my path to understand, I met people and introduction here, experience there, until eventually a friend had come along and says, hey, I discovered this group and it's right up your alley. You should come and check them out. And I attended one of their local practices, and I was living in Florida at the time. And once I saw what they were doing, I was like, this is what I've been looking for my entire life. And there was absolutely no turning back at that point. Been with the organization now for a little over 11 years, and I'm the deputy director of the organization. The ARMA, while we do have a local chapter here in Middle Tennessee, we're an international organization with study groups and chapters all over the globe.
Now, are there levels of expertise in this? I mean, I know with typically with the Eastern martial arts, there's belt colors and that sort of thing. Are there levels of skill that are somehow ranked in this?
We tend to follow our structure, tends to follow the guild structure, because during the Renaissance period, there were fighting guilds where they were essentially tantamount to martial arts schools. People would come and they would train, and they would follow certain protocols as you would in any school.
So they did this way back then?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
And so we tend to follow that type of a structure. So we do have certain rankings within the organization that are based upon the rankings that they observed and followed in the guild structure and the fight schools of medieval Western Europe. Interestingly enough, you bring up the belt structure of Eastern martial arts. Little known fact, that was actually created by Westerners.
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that. I just knew that's how big folks are ranked here, and assume that, depending on, the color of your belt, that means that you're skilled to a certain level. And now, of course, is Renaissance martial arts, is it competitive? Is it set up in, do you have tournaments? Do you spar with one another? How is it? How do you?
We do a lot of sparring. There are organizations out there who are exploring the tournament avenue. However, these treatises that validate what we do, the extant records that we study, they weren't written for tournaments. They were written for legitimate self-defense. How to deal with real violence, whether it be violence of an invading army or, again, just a city ruffian or a group of brigands who might set upon you in the street. So our approach tends to be, in order to fully understand and fully reclaim our Western martial heritage, we want to approach it as purely as possible. And since the treatises weren't written for tournaments but for the need for real self-defense, we sometimes use the expression, as much as is right, fence and play as you would in fight, meaning train as realistically as you can safely, which is exactly what they did. When they came to the fencing schools, they didn't injure one another, but they certainly were training for the real brutality of the world in which they lived. A nice parallel, or at least a reasonable parallel, might be modern U.S. soldiers. When they go through boot camp, they're taught to use firearms, and they're taught to use firearms under duress in situations which replicate the trauma or rigor of battle. But they're not using live rounds, because taking a life or acting in a defensive manner is not a prerequisite for learning how to do so. And our Renaissance martial art forebears, they understood this. So while they were able to train with intensity in the fighting schools, they did so safely. And that's what we attempt to do today.
Well, I think it's a great parallel. I didn't think about that, but it's the guys who are training in the military are not preparing for a trophy. They're not competing for an award or a plaque. I mean, it's about it becoming a part of who they are. And apparently, this is the same kind of thing.
These are the arts that were used on the battlefields of medieval Europe. So while they didn't have AK-47s at the time, it was still warfare, and this is the practices that were employed.
Now, what weapons are involved? I mean, obviously, that's one thing that sets us apart from the other martial arts is that there is weaponry involved. What are the primary weapons?
There is a huge emphasis on weaponry in our art because there was everybody back then was armed. And the longsword forms the core, the nucleus, the foundation of everything that we do, because it teaches you to fight with both hands. Both hands are on the weapon, so both hands are being employed. You can fight with your left foot forward or your right foot forward. You're actually learning to do both.
And say longsword is what it's called?
Longsword, yes. Sometimes referred to among historians as the hand and a half sword. It's a sword in which two hands are being employed on the grip.
Okay.
So that tends to teach, we look at it as a tool which teaches the body how to move. And our source literature bears this out. Most treatises begin with the longsword, and they say if you want to understand combat, learn how to use the longsword. And in fact, one treatise from approximately 1409, written by the Italian Fiore de Libieri, states, "This sword I shall also use as an axe." And there are plates, even in the German sources from Hans Talhofer in the mid-15th century, where the sword is being flipped over. And you see the cross guard and the top of now it's being wielded and used like an axe. So these longsword skills translate into everything else, including the unarmed skills. So while there is a huge emphasis on weapons, those weapons are also used as tools which teach the body how to move. They teach biomechanics. When I have new students, I have a thing I do, and unfortunately you can't really translate it here into a spoken,
right.
But I demonstrate in about 5 minutes how the first few movements that you learn with the longsword. People ask me all the time, I'm digressing here a bit, but people ask me all the time, they say, well, longsword, that's really cool, that's neat, I like that, but come on, let's be honest, you live in the 21st century. When are you ever going to have to use longsword skills in a real life or death self-defense situation? And it's a very valid question. And what I do a lot of times with new students, to get back on track, is I show them in about 5 minutes how the first few movements that you use the longsword can save your life when you leave that day. When you're attacked with a guy, just throwing punches, or a beer bottle, or a knife, you have nothing in your hands, and yet you're able to translate these biomechanics into viable real-world self-defense skills. And we tend to use the motto in the ARMA, real-world skills from real-world history. While we are using historical techniques that are documented and are valid, they are every bit as applicable today as they would have been during those times.
Now, are shields a part of this as well from a defense position?
Certainly shields were around during the medieval period, and so shields form a part of our study, as do a variety of daggers, axes, pole weapons, from, just the common staff to, the halberd, which is a staff with a big axe head on the end of it, and everything in between. If it was used during the medieval period, and particularly if it was written about in their training books and their documents, then yes, we explore it.
That's really interesting. Are these weapons are they easy to come by? Do you have to have people make these specially, or they're
one of the things that we've always emphasized and stressed is not putting anything in or taking anything out, but academic integrity, trying to understand and thereby recreate these arts as accurately as possible. They died out. So we're taking on a somewhat Herculean effort here in attempting to revive them. And if it weren't for these treatises, it would be nearly impossible. But it goes beyond simply the treatises. We go into the museums, we examine the original artifacts, the original swords, the original halberds, the original weapons. We note their heft, their length, their construction. And so in order to translate this into practical and physical application, we can't just simply walk into Swords R Us and grab any clunky 1999 Renaissance Festival special.
Right.
We need to ensure that the weapons that we're training with replicate the historical originals, because that does affect the biomechanics. And of course, the myth is there that swords weighed 30 pounds, and absolutely erroneous. Again, these were battlefield weapons of the day. And if you're in a warfare and you're in battle all day long, you try to do vigorous physical movement with a 30-pound sword, you're going to be done in 30 seconds.
Yeah, pretty short period of time, yeah.
But swords, on general, a long sword weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 pounds, which is fairly light. But it's manageable when you're using it throughout the day and when your life depends on it, and so does the man at your side. So,
gotcha. Now, if there's somebody watching and they like you, they find this fascinating and they want more information, is this something that you teach locally?
Yes, we currently hold practices in the Burns area, although I do reside here in Humphreys County and have occasionally had practices here in Waverly, where we are now, at Asbury Park. But those tend to be scheduled in advance. We also have weekly practices, which are every week, and we hold those in the Burns area.
Okay.
Currently.
Now, is there a website where they can go to get more information about this?
Yes, absolutely. For local viewers here in Humphreys County or anywhere in the Middle Tennessee region, Facebook.com/ARMA Middle Tennessee will give you a lot of information about our local chapter and what we're doing here in the Mid-State. Also, for anyone watching, whether they be here or anywhere around the world, thearma.org is our primary main website for our organization, and there's tons of articles, essays, videos. We have a forum where people can ask questions, etc.
Great. All right. Well, John, this is fascinating. I mean, like a lot of people, not familiar with this at all, and the fact that we have, someone who's so involved in it here in our county, that's interesting. I hope this generates some interest from some folks and maybe some new students. I love the historical aspect of it, the fact that it's tied to history and that as well. So, but again, thank you for being here very much. We enjoyed this. And John Farthing, who is with the ARMA, the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts, and he was our guest this week on Inside Humphreys County. We'll see you next week.